Hey, I'm Casual Jake, and today it's time to talk about Magic the Gathering. Specifically, I'll be bringing you an EDH deck tech that I'm super stoked about. The inspiration for this deck tech came from Women's History Month, so today's commander is going to feature Grand Warlord Radha, one of the baddest bees that we know. She's an incredible commander in red and green, and she's going to help us make a bunch of mana, make a bunch of tokens, make even more mana, and cast some big creatures. So let's get started. First off, we have our commander, Grand Warlord Radha. She's a 3/4 legendary elf warrior that costs 2, 1 red, and 1 green. She has haste, and whenever one or more creatures you control attack, add that much mana in any combination of red and or green until end of turn. You don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. What's great is whenever you attack with a creature, you're going to make even more mana that you can use at instant speed or even in your second main phase. And I'm going to show you some ways that we are going to utilize this commander's really powerful abilities. So the first thing I want to talk about is our utility lands. So I'm not going to go into my whole mana base, but I think these lands are important enough that we're going to mention them. So first we have Forge of Heroes. It can tap for 1 generic, or it can tap and choose your target commander, Radha, that enter the battlefield this turn, and it can put a 1/1 counter on her. And that's just going to be really great just to make her just a little bit stronger and a little bit harder to remove as far as damage-based cards go. We're also going to have Rogue's Passage, which can tap for 1 generic mana, or with 4 in tapping, we can get target creature and make it unblockable. We're going to be casting some ridiculously large creatures, and making them unblockable is just going to help us win the game. And our last utility land is Skarg the Rage Pits, which can tap for 1, or for red and green and tapping, it can give target creature +1/+1 and give that creature trample until end of turn. Again, some of these big creatures, they actually don't have trample, so giving them the ability to get trample is just going to help us plow over our opponents. Now I want to talk about Radha's war gear. If we're going to send her off to war, we need to soup her up to make sure that she's going to survive and that she's going to wreck face. So the first card I want to talk about is, of course, Swiftfoot Boots. We know it, we love it, it's EDH. It's going to give her Hexproof and Haste. We're also going to give her Dark Steel Plate, which is indestructible itself, and it's going to give Radha, or any other creature that we need at the time, indestructible. Lastly, I want to talk about Helm of the Host, a crazy legendary artifact that reads, at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a token that's a copy of equipped creature, except the token isn't legendary if equipped creature is legendary. That token gains haste. We're just going to make more and more Radhas, hopefully, make more and more mana, and just get ridiculous mana and cast some ridiculous spells. So Helm of the Host is really going to help us just do some crazy things in this deck. And even if we don't put it on Radha, we can put it on some of our other big creatures, and that's going to help us just steal away this game. So next up, I want to talk about removal. First, we're going to talk about our targeted removal. So we have Acidic Slime to help take care of any artifacts, enchantments, or lands. We also have Vengeful Rebirth, which is going to get us a card back from our graveyard, and it's going to do some damage to target creature or player. Next up, we have Red Sun Zenith for X and red, and whenever it's going to deal X damage to target creature or player. If creature dealt damage this way would be put into the graveyard this turn, we can exile it. If they have recursion on creatures, this is going to help us get them out of the way. And then we're going to shuffle Red Sun Zenith back into our library. And then lastly, we have Krosan Grip, which is a great card to destroy target artifact or enchantment. And the best part about this card is it has Split Second. As long as the spell is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. Perfect for taking down any infinite combos. Next up, I want to talk about our cards that are going to target multiple targets. We have Clan Defiance, which is going to do X damage to a creature with flying, deal X damage to a creature without flying, or should I say, or deal X damage to target player. Definitely going to want to choose all of these most of the time. Then we have Decimate, which is almost like a board wipe, but not really, but you get to choose a lot of stuff to destroy. You're going to destroy target artifact, target creature, target enchantment, and target land. And with that, you're just going to be able to... You're probably not going to be the best friends of anyone on the board, but it's definitely a good way of destroying multiple things. Next up, we have our board wipes. We have Vandal Blast, that if we overload can destroy all of our opponent's artifacts. And we have Savage Twister, which we can pump a bunch of mana into and deal that much damage to each creatures. Now, there's not many other board wipes I want to play because most of the time we're going to have these big creatures that are just going to plow through people, so we're not too worried about that. Next thing we need to talk about is our mana ramp. So I'm going to start off with Artifact as far as our mana ramp go. Soul Ring, a classic in EDH. Gruul Signet, going to help give us some more mana. Mind Stone, and then of course the biggie, Everflowing Chalice. Now this has multi-kicker, so we can pump 2 extra mana into it. And Everflowing Chalice will enter the battlefield with a charge counter on it for each time it was kicked. Using RADHA'S ability to help ramp up this Everflowing Chalice is just going to give us even more ramp the next turn. Just an incredible artifact for this deck. Next, I'm going to talk about the creatures that are going to help us ramp. We're going to play our elves, our Llanowar elves, our Elvish Mystic, and our Arbor elves, which are going to help us tap to make some green mana, and Arbor elf, of course, untapping a forest to make more. Then we have Zhur-Taa Druid, which can tap for green, and my favorite part about this is whenever you tap the Druid for mana, it's going to deal 1 damage to each opponent. So not only are you going to get more mana, you're going to cause some hurt to the rest of your opponents. Then we have Radha, Heir to Keld. We have young Radha, who's every time they attack, they're going to make 2 red mana. Now remember, this mana can't be spent in your next main phase, like the mana produced from Grand Warlord, but you can use this to pump other instant spells, or you can tap her just for a green mana. Great. Then we have a Big Daddy, Savage Ventmaw, who's going to, every time it attacks, is going to create red, 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 green, 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 and this mana isn't going to untap. Plus, if Radha's out, you're going to make even more mana from Savage Ventmaw. Then we have Goreclaw, who's going to help us cast creatures with power 4 or greater for less, and every time that Goreclaw attacks, it's going to give one of our creatures, it's going to give all of our creatures with power 4 or greater, +1/+1, and trample. Lastly, we have Druid's Repository, which whenever a creature attacks, you're going to put a charge counter on this card, and then you can remove that counter to make mana of any color. Oh my gosh, great card. We want to be attacking with creatures, and this is really going to help us just ramp even more. But since we want to attack with so many creatures, I want to talk about our token producers. One of the best ways to make some mana is to have Radha out, swing in with a bunch of tokens. We don't mind losing, because we're just going to make more. So let me talk about the one-time token producers. First, we have Chancellor of the Forge, which is going to help us create some red goblins, and if it's in our opening hand, going to give us 1 red goblin creature token to start off with. Then we have Beetleback Chief, which is going to come into play, and it's going to create 2 red goblin tokens. And then, of course, Siege Gang Commander, who's going to come into play and create 3 goblin tokens. Now I want to talk about some cards that are going to help us keep creating tokens. They're going to create them over and over again. We're just going to keep them coming. First off, we have Hanaware Garrison, which is going to partner or meld, or I don't actually know what it's called meld. It's going to meld with Hanaware Battlements to create a bigger creature. But first, Hanaware Garrison is going to create 2 1/1 red human creature tokens every time that it is tapped. And then when we meld it with Hanaware Battlements, we're going to create Hanaware the Withering Township, which has Trample and Haste. It's a 7/4, and whenever it attacks, we're going to put 2 3/2 colorless Eldrazi horror creatures onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. I don't know about you, but that's some value. Next up, we have Goblin Rabblemaster, which is going to create a red goblin creature token at the beginning of every combat. And it's also going to force all of our goblins to attack each turn if they're able to, which we're not too worried about because we want to be attacking and making mana. And whenever Goblin Rabblemaster attacks, it's going to also boost up our goblins a little bit. And then we also have Goblin Assault, which at the beginning of your upkeep, you're going to create a 1/1 goblin with haste. And it also makes your goblins attack every turn if possible. Next up, we have Ant Queen, who's a mana sink, who's going to create a 1/1 green insect creature token for 1 and a green. And we also have Dragon Lair Spider, who has reach. And whenever opponent casts a spell, we're going to put a 1/1 green insect creature token onto the battlefield. This is insane. Instants, sorceries, creatures, whenever anyone is cast a spell, we're going to make a token. And in EDH, you know that there's going to be 3 people casting spells before it comes back to your turn. This card just smells of value. Next up, I want to talk about the big guns, right? The creatures that are going to help us just trample and destroy our opponents. And first thing I want to talk about are creatures that are going to help us with counters. You got Loyal Guardian, who, if your commander's out, they're going to put counters on all of our creatures. Mistcutter Hydra, who comes in for X and green, is going to have protection from blue, can't be countered, and come in with X 1/1 counters. And then one of my personal favorite cards, Vigor, who's also going to give us some protection. Because if damage would be dealt to any creature we control, we're going to prevent that damage and put a counter on that creature for each 1 damage prevented this way. And when Vigor is put into the graveyard from anywhere, we're going to shuffle it back into our library. Now, I've played games where Vigor got removed and went to the graveyard, and then I was somehow able to get it back from the library by drawing, and let me just tell you, that kind of recursion is just priceless. Next up, we have Hydra Omnivore. Now, this pairs so good with our land, Rogue's Passage, because we can make it unblockable, and whenever it does damage, it's going to do damage to all our other opponents as well, and that is, again, just some value. Next up, we have Galta, a huge 12/12, who's going to get easier to cast the more creatures we have. Then we have Ulamog's Crusher. With Annihilator 2, that means whenever this creature attacks, defending player is going to sacrifice 2 permanents. You want to know how to become the threat? Play Ulamog's Crusher, or, better yet, play Artisan of Kozilek, who's not only going to get us a creature back, but it also has Annihilator 2. Now I want to talk about the people who are going to ping, the cards that are going to do just little damage over the game and really going to help us just eat away at our opponent's life totals. First off, we have Cindervines, so whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, it's going to deal 1 damage to them, and even better, for 1 and sacrifice, we can destroy an artifact or enchantment and do some more damage. Great for any pesty enchantments or artifacts that our opponents are using. Next up, we have Burning Tree Shaman. Whenever a player plays an activated ability that isn't a mana ability, Burning Tree Shaman is going to deal 1 damage to that player. And then lastly, we have Hellrider, who has haste, is a 3/3, and whenever a creature you control attacks, it's going to do 1 damage to defending player. With all these tokens that we're going to have, we're going to be doing a lot of just incidental damage just by throwing them in, and we don't really care if they die because we're just going to make more tokens. So Hellrider is definitely going to help us win in the long run. Next up, we have some protection. Silent Gravestone, for instance, going to help us protect against any of those pesky graveyard synergies. Then we have Gruul Spellbreaker, who's going to also give us hexproof on our turn. Then we have Rhythm of the Wild, which is going to make sure our creature spells can't be countered, and non-token creatures that we control are going to have Riot, meaning we can give them haste or a 1/1 counter. This is a new mechanic that just came out with Ravnica Allegiance, and one that I love to play. Lastly, on this part, we have Archetype of Endurance. Archetype is going to give all of our creatures hexproof and make all our opponents lose hexproof, which is super useful if you're trying to deal with some commanders or other creatures that we just are having a hard time getting rid of. Now I want to talk about what's going to give our creatures haste. We're going to make tokens. We're going to make these big creatures. We want to swing out with them as soon as possible. So these cards are going to help us do that. First, we have Fires of Yavimaya. It's going to give our creatures haste, and we can sacrifice it to give a creature +2/+2 until end of turn. Good at saving some creatures if we are worried about damage-based removal. Next up, we have Cyclops of Eternal Fury, who's a creature who's a 5/3, a pretty big guy himself, and he's going to give all of our creatures haste as well. Lastly, we have this awesome card in the Web of War that's going to give creatures that come into our battlefield +2/+0 and give them haste until end of turn. That's going to help us turn those little 1/1s into 3/1s, and no one's really going to want to be blocking that. Next up, we have Card Draw. This deck, red and green, not always known for their card draw, but this deck, we need to make sure that we have it. When you're in EDH, you need cards, and we're going to be casting a bunch of spells each turn, so we need to make sure we have these cards. So in the 1-time slot, we have the Flame of Keld, which is going to make us discard our hand, but don't worry, we'll hopefully be discarding after we played a bunch of spells, because the next turn we're going to draw 2 cards, and then in turn 3, it's going to help us do some extra damage. We're also going to play Shamanic Revelation, which means we're going to draw a card for each creature we control. Great value when we have all those tokens on the field. This is just going to mean insane card draw. Next, I want to talk about some repeatable card draw. We have Colossal Majesty. At the beginning of our upkeep, if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, which we probably will, we'll draw a card. We have Beast Whisperer, which every time we cast a creature spell, we're going to draw a card. We have Lifecrafter's Bestiary. At the beginning of your upkeep, we're going to scry 1, and every time we cast a creature spell, we can pay green to draw a card. And then one of my personal favorites, Experimental Frenzy. I feel like a lot of people didn't see the potential with this card, but I think this goes really well in this deck, because we can look at the top card of our library, we can play the top card of our library, but we can't play cards from our hand. What this means is if we have creatures or other cards that we want to play with all this mana we make from Radha, we can just play it right there while refilling our hand, drawing each turn, and then when we're ready, we can pay 3 in red, destroy this, and we can use our hand again. Lastly, I want to talk about our win cons. Okay, we get it. You're going to make tokens, you're going to make big things, but how are we going to win the game? Well, let me tell you. First, we're going to talk about burning them out with some spells. First off, we have Red Sun Zenith, which we talked about earlier, which we can use to pump mana in, a lot of that Radha mana, to burn our opponents to the face. Then we have Jaya's Emulating Inferno, which we have to have a legendary creature out, which mostly will have Radha out. And we can pump mana to this and deal X damage to each of up to 3 targets. And let me see, EDH, how many opponents do we have? 1, 3. We can hit each of our opponents with a bunch of damage if we make a bunch of mana, which we will, from Radha. Next up, I want to talk about All Out Assault. We want to swing these guys in and we want to beat face. So cards that we can use to help with that are Blinding Flare, which for 1 red and 1 extra red for each target beyond the first, we can make those creatures not block, which is going to let us get in with a bunch of damage. Then we have Beastmaster's Ascension, a classic EDH staple, which we're going to put counters on. And then once we get 7 counters, we're going to give all of our creatures +5/+5, make them huge. Those little 1/1s aren't looking so small again. Another way that we're going to make these tokens huge is with Essence of the Wild. Creatures you control into the battlefield, it's a copy of Essence of the Wild, which, by the way, is a 6/6. Again, those 1/1s turning for 6/6, yes, I think so, especially when we give them haste. Then you have Angrath's Marauder, which is going to double the damage of our permanents. And Triumph of the Hordes, which is going to give all of our creatures +1/+1 and Trample and Infect. Yes, this card goes really well in this kind of deck where you're swinging out, and sometimes just swinging out with one person and giving all your creatures Infect will just take them out of the game. Remember, they only need to take 10 Infect damage to lose the game, and Triumph of the Hordes is going to help us get that. The last thing I want to talk about is our extra combat steps. What better way to win the game than just to keep pummeling them with Radha in the lead, just leading her army into victory. And so a few of these cards are going to help us with that. First, we have Relentless Assault, which is going to let you untap all your creatures that attack this turn. And then after this main phase, there's an additional combat phase. Usually, you can use your mana from Radha after 1 attack and play this card. But let me tell you about the combo potential of Hellkite Charger, which reads Flying, Haste, and whenever Hellkite Charger attacks, you may pay 5 and red. If you do, untap all attacking creatures, and after this phase, there is an additional combat phase. Now let me tell you, if you have token generators and you have enough people attacking that can survive that will make 7 mana, you can just keep attacking over and over and over again. What you're gonna do is you're gonna attack, make a bunch of mana, you're gonna pay 5 and 2 red, and then you're gonna untap and do it all again until you'll win the game. Well, thank you for tuning in today. I really appreciate you looking at the deck tech. I'm going to put the full deck list in the descriptions if you want to check it out. If you have any suggestions or any things that you want to add that you think would go good in this deck, even if you have a Grand Warlord Radha deck, go ahead and tell me about it in the comments. I'd love to hear some suggestions. Always looking to tune up my decks and make them even stronger and just have a good time. I think this deck is pretty affordable already. I know there's some expensive cards, but I'm considering maybe doing a budget video on this deck, as I think Grand Warlord Radha is just an insane commander to build around, and there's a lot of budget options. So thank you so much. I appreciate you tuning in. Check out all of the links, of course, in the description, and don't forget to play your land drops. Have a good one, everyone.